Part 1: A Tale of Two Kingdoms. In 1066, William, the Duke of Normandy, conquered England. When he died in 1087, his eldest son Robert took Normandy, while his second son William Rufus became King of England. Their youngest brother, Henry, later seized the throne in 1100 after William Rufus was shot by an arrow, becoming King Henry I. King Henry I lost his only son in 1120, leaving his daughter Matilda, widow of the late Holy Roman Emperor Henry V, as heir. She married Geoffrey, the Count of Anjou and Maine in France. Their son, Henry, became King Henry II of England in 1154, starting the Plantagenet dynasty, meaning broom cap, from the broom flowers Geoffrey often wore on his hat. In 1152, Henry II married Eleanor, the Duchess of Aquitaine, gaining vast lands in the Kingdom of France. Before long, the English king controlled more French land than the King of France himself. But this created conflict, since the King of England ruled England as an independent, sovereign monarch, but held French lands like Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine as a vassal to the King of France. Arguments over loyalty and power soon led to war. After Henry II died in 1189, England faced unrest while France grew stronger. King Philip II of France proved clever and bold. In 1214, at the Battle of Bouvines, he defeated England and took back nearly all its French lands, leaving only Aquitaine. The next year, English nobles forced King John to sign the Magna Carta, while Philip II earned the title Augustus. The wars between England and France went quiet, for now. In 1259, King Henry III of England and King Louis IX of France signed the Treaty of Paris. Henry III gave up many claims in France, but kept Aquitaine, and agreed to pay Louis IX a liege homage, recognizing Louis as his lord. This created confusion about who truly held power. Because borders were unclear, Counts in Aquitaine sometimes switched loyalty between the two kings to gain an advantage. Gascony, now the heart of English lands in France, often leaned toward English rule. The local nobles enjoyed trade with England, and fewer limits on their rights. Bordeaux, the main city in the region, grew rich and crowded through the lucrative wine trade. By 1300, ships carried more than 80,000 tons of wine each year, with England buying about a quarter of it. Taxes on the trade gave the English crown a steady income. In 1293, a fight between Gascon and Norman sailors let King Philip IV of France seize Aquitaine, though he later returned it to England. In 1295, France joined Scotland in the Auld Alliance to counter England. Disputes between England and France continued throughout the early 1300s, with unrest in Bordeaux, failed peace talks, and attacks, such as the burning of the French town of Saint Sardos in 1323. Each time, France declared the Aquitaine confiscated, and each time, uneasy truces followed. A serious issue came on February 1st, 1328, when King Charles IV of France died at 33 years old. He had left no son to succeed him, and only a pregnant wife, Joan of Evreux. If her child was a boy, the royal line of the Capet dynasty would continue. But in April, she gave birth to a girl, and the Capetian male line ended after ruling France for over 300 years. The closest heir through blood was Charles's niece, Isabella, who had married King Edward II of England. Their son, Edward III, was now King of England and grandson of Philip IV of France. This gave Edward III a strong claim to the French throne. But another rival stood nearer to the crown, Philip of Valois, a nephew of Philip IV. The French nobility disliked the idea of a foreign king. Accepting Isabella as their monarch would avoid this issue, but they had already ruled that a woman cannot succeed to the Kingdom of France, a concept known as Salic law. In 1317, this law had once blocked Joan of Navarre when King John I died, and now it blocked both Isabella and her son Edward from inheriting France. When news came that Joan of Evreux gave birth to a daughter, Philip of Valois acted quickly. He claimed the crown and became King Philip VI. Edward III did not fight the decision right away. In 1329, under pressure, he paid homage to Philip VI at Amiens for Aquitaine. The ceremony was intense. Edward refused to give a full liege homage, recognizing Philip VI as landlord, but not as sovereign. Both sides left dissatisfied. Afterwards, Edward III turned north to Scotland. His grandfather, Edward I, had fought there but died on campaign. His father, Edward II, lost badly to King Robert the Bruce at Bannockburn in 1314. When Robert died in 1329, his son David II became King of Scotland. But another man, Edward Balliol, also wanted the crown. Edward III let him raise 3,000 English archers. In 1332, Balliol landed at Fife, won at Duplamoor with a deadly and powerful English longbow, and briefly took the throne before being driven out. Edward then marched north. In 1333, he besieged Berwick, near the Scottish-English border. In July, the Scots tried to break the siege at Hallydon Hill, overlooking the town. Their spearmen advanced, but the arrows of Edward's longbowmen cut through the Scots, who broke and fled. Thousands died, while the English lost only a handful. Berwick fell the next day, and David II fled to France. As Edward grew stronger, King Philip VI of France planned a crusade to the Holy Land, but also wanted to protect his Scottish ally. The peace talks with Edward failed in 1334, when Philip demanded Scotland be included. Edward grew alarmed when Philip moved his fleet, meant for the crusade, to closer home in Normandy instead. Edward struck back by banning all wool exports to France. This devastated the rich, urban economy of Flanders, in modern-day Belgium. Flanders relied on English wool in order to manufacture clothing, and the ban caused riots and turned Flemish towns against French authority. Edward also sheltered Robert of Artois, a French noble who had fled France accused of forgery and murder. Philip demanded Robert's return. Edward refused. Philip had had enough, and on May 24, 1337, seized Gascony. In October, Edward responded with a formal letter of defiance to Philip of Valois, who calls himself King of France, officially laying claim to the French throne. The 100-Year War had begun. Part 2. A Vow to a Heron. Edward quickly got to work preparing for war. To raise money, he reopened the wool trade, but sent it to Brabant instead of Flanders, winning Duke John III to his side. Even with his own royal income of £80,000 a year, it was not enough. Edward taxed nobles, towns and abbeys, pawned royal jewels, took loans from Italian bankers, forced merchants to lend money, and even seized half of England's wool crop to sell abroad. With this cash, he bribed allies and built support in the Low Countries and the Holy Roman Empire. The first clash came in November 1337, when English troops crushed Flemish soldiers at Cadsand. In July 1338, Edward landed at Antwerp with 4,000 men. But war is expensive, and his army quickly ran out of money, food, and supplies, while his German allies demanded more pay. To win them over, Edward traveled to Koblenz to meet Holy Roman Emperor Louis IV. He showered Louis with board gifts and promises, and in return, Louis named Edward Imperial Vicar, giving him power to fight France in the name of the Empire. France struck back at sea. Hard Genoese galleys raided the island of Guernsey, killed its defenders, and soon after burned and looted Southampton in England. On land, Philip's ally John, the blind king of Bohemia, seized towns in Gascony and cut Bordeaux off from England. French ships also raided Devon, Cornwall, Plymouth, and Hastings, before the Genoese sailors deserted over unpaid wages. By 1339, Edward had sunk into a debt of £300,000, with little to show for it. He pawned his crown, mortgaged horses, borrowed at ruinous rates, and let his wife and children serve as hostages to creditors in Ghent. Powerful Italian banking families like the Bardi and Prusy weakened under the strain, while English merchant William Pole rose as Edward's chief creditor, lending over £111,000. Starting in September 1339, Edward invaded France from the Low Countries with about 10,000 men. He moved through Picardy, burning villages and besieging Cambrai. Philip had a larger army of 25,000 nearby, but hoped winter and hunger would wear Edward down before a battle could take place. By October, both armies faced each other near Péronne. The French challenged Edward to a battle, but their leaders quarreled and feared the English longbows. They pulled back, forcing Edward to retreat as well. Meanwhile, Flemish towns rebelled against their rulers because trade suffered without English wool. Their leader, Jacob van Artevelde, pushed Edward to double down on his claim to the French crown. At a ceremony in Ghent in January 1340, Edward added the French fleur-de-lis to his coat of arms and called himself King of France. Edward returned to England a year later to ask Parliament for more money. They agreed to fund the war, but only if he promised no new taxes without their consent, and that England would never be ruled by the French, even if he did win the French crown. Edward accepted, and sailed with 250 ships and a new army. On June 24th, 1340, his fleet met the French and their Castilian allies at Sluys, on the Zwin estuary. The French had better warships compared to the clunky English cogs, but they were tightly packed into Sluys harbor, limiting movement. When the English attacked, their archers rained hell on the helpless Frenchmen below. English soldiers then boarded and fought hand to hand. By night, almost all the French ships were sunk or taken, giving Edward a major victory. The naval battle at Sluys gave Edward new strength. In southern France, Philip lost loyal allies. The great families of Armagnac, Albret, and Foix turned against him. Oliver Ingham, the English commander in Gascony, won the support of Bernard Hayes II of Albret. Bernard Hayes feared the Foix and wanted power, so he joined England. This helped Edward send an army into Gascony. In 1340, English and Gascon troops swept through southern France. Towns gave food and support to them, but by autumn, French forces put down most of the revolt. Still, it drained Philip's money and men, while Edward planned another invasion from Flanders. But this was not as successful, as at Saint Omer in July, a Flemish army under Robert of Artois broke. That summer, another English army besieged Tournai. The city held strong, supplies ran out, and allies argued. Swarmed by his furious creditors demanding their money back, Edward abandoned the siege in November. Edward's campaign had failed. He lost ground in France and in Scotland, now that King David II had returned from exile. Edward's immense debt of around £500,000 sterling ruined English credit and utterly broke the great Italian banks of Bardi and Peruzzi. Heavy taxes and his arbitrary dismissal of officials upon returning to England sparked riots. Philip had hurt his kingdom too. Taxes rose, silver coinage lost over half of its value, and raids burned towns across northern France. Neither king could claim victory, and the 9-month Truce of Espluchen was signed in September. Before the Truce of Espluchen was up, a new opportunity to get an edge over the enemy opened up in Brittany. In 1341, John III, the Duke of Brittany, died without children. His niece, Joan of Ponthièvre, and her husband, Charles of Blois, had the strongest claims to the duchy. But John III's half-brother, John of Montfort, feared Philip would back his nephew, Charles of Blois. Montfort quickly seized Nantes and called himself Duke. Some nobles opposed him, but many knights, priests, and peasants supported him. Civil war broke out. French troops soon drove Montfort out. He fled to England and asked Edward for help. Brittany offered safe ports for English ships and a secure foothold in France, so Edward agreed to send some troops. Montfort returned while the French besieged Nantes. Not wanting a long siege, the people of Nantes handed him over. Montfort was taken to Paris as a prisoner. His wife, Joan of Flanders, carried on the fight. In the winter of 1341-42, she defended Embrun and kept the road to Brest open, letting English troops land in the spring. That autumn, Robert of Artois beat Charles of Blois at Morlaix, though sickness weakened the English momentum. In October 1342, Edward himself landed with 5,000 men and besieged Vannes, while his army raided their Breton countryside. In early 1343, the French, led by Philip's son, John, the Duke of Normandy, approached, but they did not fight. Instead, Pope Clement VI arranged peace talks. Both sides then agreed to the Truce of Malstra, set to last until 1346. Part 3. The Land Desires to Have Me. Even though the Truce of Malstra was set to last until 1346, both Edward and Philip were already preparing for war. One condition of the truce was to release Montfort from prison, but the French failed to do this. So, in 1345, Edward tore up the truce and sent Henry of Lancaster, the Earl of Derby, to attack Gascony. Lancaster landed at Bordeaux on August 9th. With Bernard Eyes II of Albret's support, he struck Bergerac, an important crossing on the Dordogne River. The French army fled in panic, but Lancaster's cavalry and archers cut them down and stormed the town. French defenses in the southwest collapsed. Lancaster then marched north toward Périgueux. When 3,000 French besieged Abroche Castle, he struck at dawn on October 21st. English arrows broke the French, and his cavalry trampled them as they ran. Many nobles were captured, and their hefty ransoms made Lancaster's army rich. Philip was paralyzed. Through the winter, Lancaster pushed deeper. He raided towns in the Garonne Valley, and fear spread. Meanwhile, Philip faced a financial crisis. He had raised new harsh taxes on hearse and salt, but these proved insufficient and angered the people. He borrowed money, even from the Pope, and hired Genoese ships and crossbowmen. In April 1346, his son, Prince John of Normandy, besieged Anguilla with a huge army, while only 900 English defenders held out. They blocked weak spots with barrels of stones and raided the enemy daily. After months of hunger and disease, John of Normandy abandoned the siege in August. Edward planned to invade France once again. He no longer trusted allies like Flanders, so he raised men, ships, and supplies solely from England. He borrowed or forced loans from merchants, towns, and churchmen. Landowners had to serve by wealth, poorer men as archers, richer men as knights or commanders. Many archers came from Wales. In June 1346, Edward sailed with 750 ships and 10,000 troops, landing at the Cotentin Peninsula. While disembarking, Edward fell and got a nosebleed, and the knights that were about him took him up and said, "Sir, for God's sake, enter again into your ship, and come not to land this day, for this is but an evil sign for us." Then the king answered quickly and said, "Wherefore? This is a good token for me, for the land desireth to have me." Of which the answer all his men were right joyful. Indeed, it would prove to be a good sign. The English attacked Caen, where Philip had gathered troops. English archers crossed local rivers, and men-at-arms stormed the fences. Around 5,000 Frenchmen died, and the town was plundered for 5 days. Edward then marched east, burning towns until they neared Paris. Philip chased the English away from Paris and then north towards the Somme River, where he failed to trap the English at Blanche-Teque on August 24th. 2 days later, the French finally caught up with the English at Crécy. That day, the French attacked in 3 waves. The first wave saw Philip's Genoese crossbowmen be cut down by English longbowmen, who fired faster and farther. The French cavalry then attacked, and they too were shot down. By nightfall, Philip had fled, leaving behind 1,500 dead French knights and nobles, including King John of Bohemia. The English stood victorious. After the Battle of Crécy, Edward thought about marching on Paris, but lacked the soldiers to do so. French forces stayed strong, so he aimed for Calais instead, a coastal town near Flanders. Calais guarded the narrowest point of the English Channel between England and France, which meant it would be easier for Edward to ship men and material to and from the mainland. Edward hoped Calais would surrender fast, but its gates stayed shut. In September 1346, he began a siege that lasted almost a year. Winter passed as Edward camped before the walls, unable to do much. Meanwhile, Henry of Lancaster won victories in the south, retaking Aquitaine, capturing Poitiers, and sending many prisoners and riches back to Bordeaux. In July 1347, Philip tried to rescue Calais, but failed due to poor preparation. By August 4th, the starving defenders gave up. Edward expelled the local French elite and replaced them with English families, making Calais the main English port for wool and European trade. Calais would stay under English rule until the French retook it in 1553. After the long campaign, Edward's treasury was empty. He agreed to a truce with Philip in September 1347 and sailed home in October. Elsewhere, English commanders also struck blows. In Brittany, Sir John Dagworth captured Charles of Blois at the Battle of La Roche-Derrien in June. In northern England, the Scots invaded, but at Neville's Cross in October, English archers crushed them. King David II was wounded, captured, and taken in chains to the Tower of London. Edward came home to a joyful England. People cheered his victory at Crécy with feasts, tournaments, and parades. Captured nobles like King David and Charles of Blois even joined in on the events. Prisoners were worth money through expensive ransoms, so it made sense to keep them alive and treat them well. Chivalry also called for honor and respect toward defeated enemies. France, on the other hand, faced sorrow. The loss of Crécy and Calais shamed Philip. When he asked the States General for money, they criticized his poor leadership, but still gave some support. He planned to rebuild his fleet to strike England, but another disaster struck first. In 1347, Genoese merchant ships from the Black Sea arrived in Italy, carrying rats and fleas that spread a deadly sickness. People fell ill quickly, their bodies swelling with dark buboes, and most died in hours or days. This disease reached France in late 1347 and spread to England by mid-1348. The Black Death swept across Europe, killing up to a third of its population. Whole villages became ghost towns, and crops withered in the fields. People desperately searched for answers to the anarchy. Some blamed vulnerable minorities such as the Jews, while others turned to extreme faith. like the Flagellants, who whipped themselves to show sorrow for their sins. In England and France, labor grew scarce as there were fewer peasants. Because their work was more valuable in these dire times, they asked for better pay and privileges. Both Edward and Philip tried and failed to resist increasing them. In August 1350, Philip died, leaving the French throne to his son, John of Normandy, who now became King John II. The devastating effects of the plague began to slow down in England and France in the 1350s, allowing war to resume. The Truce of Calais was still in place, but France's Castilian allies ignored it. Their 40 ships at Sluys often fought with English sailors in the North Sea. Fearing raids on his coast, Edward took 50 ships and struck the Castilian fleet. On August 29th, near Winchelsea, English ships rammed the Castilians, while archers cut down the crews, and soldiers boarded the ships to slaughter the rest. The English captured nearly half the enemy fleet. King John II of France tried to train his men for war, but money was short. The plague had ruined France's currency, which lost most of its value and made food very costly. Still, battles broke out. Throughout 1351, the French successfully besieged Saint Jean d'Angely in Aquitaine, and in July 1352, English raiders seized the castle of Guines in a daring strike, adding it to the Pale of Calais. Meanwhile, the war in Brittany raged. In March 1351, two rival garrisons staged the Combat of the 30, a bloody contest of 30 knights on each side. The French won after several hours of fighting, and the survivors from both sides were celebrated for their bravery and chivalry. By 1354, peace talks at Guines would have given Edward nearly all the old Angevin lands, excluding Brittany and Normandy. The English Parliament celebrated, but the French ultimately rejected the deal. Part 4. The Years of Chevauchée. The failed peace talks at Guines began a new phase of the war. In 1354, Charles II, the King of Navarre, sided with Edward. Much like Edward, he had a strong claim to the French throne, and much like Edward, his mother Joan was barred from the French succession in 1328 because she was a woman. A tipping point came when John II had given the role of Constable of France to a Castilian noble. Feeling cheated, Charles II trapped and killed the constable. John managed to calm him for a time, but Charles II's plotting gave Edward new chances to attack. In 1355, Edward launched a three-way assault on France from Picardy, Normandy, and Aquitaine. His son and heir, Edward, the Black Prince of Wales, led the boldest strike. With only 2,600 men, he rode from Bordeaux across southern France in a chevauchée. His army burned towns like Carcassonne and Narbonne, seized food, and terrified the region of Languedoc. The aim of chevauchées were to ruin French lands, block taxes, and show John's weakness as a king. Villages burned, peasants fled, and the damage lasted for years. To raise money, John cut the value of silver coins 8 times, one time nearly by half. This gave him quick cash, but hurt nobles and landowners. In December, the Estates General granted new taxes, but put special commissions, not John, in charge of the money. Some nobles lost faith in John and turned to Charles II, and rumors soon spread that Charles was plotting with John's heir, the Dauphin Charles, to overthrow his father. In April 1356, John arrested Charles II at a banquet and executed 4 of his allies without trial. In June 1356, Henry of Lancaster landed in Normandy with 2,400 men. The Dauphin Charles had already taken and burned Navarre's holdings in Normandy, such as Evreux, so Lancaster turned to other towns. At Pont-à-Mousson, his men surprised the French, who fled and left their weapons. The English then raided Conches, Breteuil, and Verneuil, burning towns as they went. By July, Lancaster's chevauchée was over. At the same time, Edward, the Black Prince, gathered 10,000 men in Gascony to join Lancaster. As he marched north starting in July, villages panicked, castles prepared for sieges, and people fled. His men burned towns and looted churches and castles throughout central France. By late August, the Black Prince reached the Loire River. John wasted time in Normandy before moving south to confront the English. Near Poitiers, he blocked their path with over 10,000 men. The prince, now with only 6,000, tried to avoid battle by offering a ransom, but John demanded surrender. On September 19th, they fought. Multiple waves of French cavalry were repelled by archers, until John's force was all that was left. When he charged, a hidden English force led by Jean de Grailly, the Captal de Buch, surprised and struck John from behind. John himself fought until he was surrounded and forced to surrender. King David now had royal company at the Tower of London. The King of France was now a prisoner of the English. The Dauphin Charles, only 18 years old, took charge of France. The Dauphin seemed weak, as he had no skill in war, and trusted his father's poor advisors. His first move was to raise money, but this made people angry. They pitied their captured king, but hated the nobles who lost battles and demanded taxes. France soon fell into chaos. In Paris, townsfolk rose up under 2 men, Etienne Marcel, a merchant, and Robert Lecoq, a bishop. They freed Charles, who gathered an army and raided the north. In 1357, the Estates General forced reforms on the Dauphin and told him to remove corrupt officials. He refused. By autumn, Charles had stirred up the mobs in Paris. In February 1358, they stormed into the Dauphin's room, killed his marshals in front of him, and forced him to wear the colors of the Parisian rebels. The Dauphin escaped in March and declared himself regent of France. But this moment of triumph was short-lived. In May, thousands of peasants across northern France, crushed by war, plague, and burdensome taxes, rose up in despair. This Jacquerie revolt saw estates burned and nobles killed with shocking cruelty, though the peasants lacked proper skill and weapons. Their barbarism united nobles and townsmen against the Jacquerie, and the forces of Charles crushed the revolt by August. Paris soon surrendered, rebel leaders were slain, and the Dauphin returned to restore order. Upon regaining power, the Dauphin worked to free his father from English captivity. They negotiated the Treaty of London, which would give England 1/3 of France, and set John's ransom at 4 million gold crowns, or around £666,000 sterling. In return, Edward gave up his claim to the French throne. But in the second treaty, Edward demanded more land, and drew Maine, Normandy, Brittany, and the Pale of Calais. The French Estates General refused, and Edward now had a reason to invade again. He quickly raised 30,000 men, who were encouraged by the victory at Poitiers. Landed at Calais in October 1359. His bold plan was to march across France in a chevauchée, destroy the land, and crown himself King of France at Reims Cathedral, where French kings were traditionally crowned. But Reims had stocked food and built defenses to survive a siege. The English arrived in December, forced to camp in the snow. By January, storms and losses forced Edward to abandon Reims. He raided through Burgundy before being paid by its Duke, Philip, to leave. Afterwards, the English moved towards Paris. Edward hoped the Dauphin would leave Paris to fight, but he refused. After 2 weeks of waiting, Edward decided to keep moving. In April 1360, near Chartres, a sudden freak hailstorm halted his army. Countless men and horses died, wagons sank, and survivors froze. Broken and starving, Edward accepted that peace was his only option. On May 1st, 1360, peace talks opened at Brittany, near Chartres. Within a week, the Black Prince and the Dauphin agreed to terms. John's ransom was dropped to 3 million gold crowns. England gave up claims to the French throne in return for Calais, land near the Somme, as well as an enlarged Aquitaine with full sovereignty. On October 24th, the Treaty of Brittany was confirmed at Calais. Edward promised to give up the French crown once all the land was handed over. And though both sides never made formal renunciations, Edward did stop calling himself King of France. In October, 2/3 of the first ransom, John returned home, but he left 3 sons as hostages. The ransom came from harsh taxes on salt, wine, goods, and from marrying off John's young daughter Isabella to the Duke of Milan's son. By spring 1362, most land was transferred to English hands. Edward now ruled the vast Aquitaine, about 1/3 of France. Many locals disliked English rule. Some feared higher taxes or remembered past chevauchés. Yet, there was no revolt. Many local officials stayed in their place, and Edward made the Black Prince Duke of Aquitaine. Edward's gains shocked Europe, as the weak and poor Kingdom of England had successfully forced mighty France to its knees. But the Treaty of Brittany left disputes unsolved, such as the English never formally renouncing their claim, as not every parcel of land that was promised to be handed over was. War still raged in Brittany, while new conflicts in and between Castile and Aragon in the Iberian Peninsula opened up new opportunities for England and France to gain a new ally. Both sides knew that war would return before long.